Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So today we are going to continue with the lecture. For today's topic, I'm going to talk about the powers of the public prosecutor, or for short, the powers of the PP. On the topic of the powers of the public prosecutor, firstly, the provisions for those powers. Where are those powers derived from? So mainly they are from two provisions under the Federal Constitution and also under the CPC, the Criminal Procedure Code. So first we talk about the Constitution. The Constitution Article 145 bracket 3, or usually referred to as Article 1453 of the Federal Constitution, provide for the Attorney General shall have power exercisable in his discretion at his discretion to institute, conduct, and discontinue any proceedings for an offence other than proceedings before a Sharia court, a native court, or a court martial. So the Attorney General here is the public prosecutor. The public prosecutor is the Attorney General. The AG, Attorney General, AG is for Attorney General, PP is for Public Prosecutor. So Article 1453 provides for the PP to have the powers to institute, conduct, and discontinue. But those powers does not extend to proceedings before Sharia court, native court, or a court martial. Sharia court, as you are aware, Sharia court concerns with Islamic laws in this country. A native court, I think, has been abolished now. We used to have the native court in Sabah and Sarawak. And the court martial. Court martial is a court for armed forces offences under offences by personnel of the armed forces and be prosecuted by the armed forces themselves are called court martial. So powers of the PP does not extend to these three. So bear in mind those words: institute, conduct, and discontinue. Those are going to be the main topic of our discussion. Other than that, we also have section 376 of the Criminal Procedure Code. The section 376 provides that the Attorney General shall be the public prosecutor. As I already mentioned just now, the Constitution provides for the Attorney General's powers under Article 1453. And then the CPC section 376 says the AG, the Attorney General, shall be the public prosecutor and shall have the control and direction of all criminal prosecutions and proceedings under this code. So the words you have to look out for here are control and direction of all criminal prosecutions and proceedings under this code. Okay, that's the powers of the PP himself. The PP is the AG. And then 3762 says the Solicitor General shall have the powers of a Deputy Public Prosecutor and shall act as the Public Prosecutor in case of the absence or inability to act of the Attorney General. So in the absence or inability to act of the Attorney General, then the Solicitor General will become the public prosecutor, shall have all the powers of the public prosecutor. And I think you all should know by now in our system public service, in our public service system, we have the Attorney General and also public prosecutor. At the moment is Tan Sri Idrus Harun, and we have the Solicitor General. I think the post provides for 3 Solicitor General: Solicitor General number 1, Solicitor General number 2, and Solicitor General number 3. I'm not sure how many of these posts has been filled up, but we read the news recently. Dato' Abdul Razak Musa has been appointed to be the Solicitor General, replacing the previous Solicitor General who has retired. Dato' Abdul Razak last year came to USIM to give a lecture on our invitation. Okay, as to the Solicitor General and Public Prosecutor, there is one issue, that is the meaning of the word absence or inability to act. So, absence of or inability to act here does not mean that when there is no Attorney General, and then the Solicitor General will step into the shoes of the Attorney General to be the public prosecutor. That's not the situation. The meaning of absence or inability to act here include absence such as on leave or going out station, and then this has been provided for in the case of Leong Kok Wat. Let's see whether this case is in your textbook or not. Leong Kok Wat. Yes, Leong Kok Wat at page 225. Page 225 of your textbook, Leong Kok Wat, 1998, 6 MLJ. What happened in this case? The accused appealed against his conviction for an offence on the ground that the approval for his prosecution was signed by the Solicitor General as the Attorney General was not around. The court dismissed the appeal and held the word absence connotes not only physical but also on leave or outstation. So, the Solicitor General can exercise the powers of the PP in the absence of the Attorney General. So absence here does not mean that if there is no Attorney General, nobody has been appointed Attorney General, like the absence of head of state or something like that. But to deputize, because the Solicitor General is also a DPP, to deputize, to carry out the power. In this absence here, meaning that he's not available, he's on leave, he's doing something else, the Solicitor General can step in. Okay, I hope you understand that. Then, other than the Solicitor General, 3763 also provides that the public prosecutor may appoint fit and proper persons to be the deputy public prosecutors. Deputy public prosecutors who shall be under the general control and direction of the public prosecutor and may exercise all any of the rights and powers vested or in or exercisable by the public prosecutor by or under this code or any other written law, except any rights or powers expressed to be exercisable by the public prosecutor personally, and he may designate any of such deputy public prosecutors as senior deputy public prosecutors. So this section provides for the post of deputy public prosecutors and senior deputy public prosecutors who can carry out all the powers of the public prosecutor under the direction and control of the public prosecutors. Okay. Unless there is a provision under the law that says that these powers must be exercised by the public prosecutor personally, then only the deputy public prosecutor and senior deputy public prosecutors cannot exercise these powers. So this is the provisions that provides for the post of deputy public prosecutor, a post which I once held before I retire and join the university and here teaching you all. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is you have all these people. Remember all these people, the Attorney General, which is the public prosecutor, the Solicitor General who will fill in for the public prosecutor when the Attorney General is not around. And then there is also a Deputy Public Prosecutor and Senior Deputy Public Prosecutors who will be carrying out the powers of the public prosecutor under the control and direction of the public prosecutors. So these are the people concerned as far as prosecutions in general or anything relating to prosecutions in general. So what are those things relating to prosecutions? Is the initiation of proceedings, prosecution itself, the conduct of the prosecution, and the discontinuance of those proceedings, because that is what is what being provided for under the constitution, the initiation, the conduct, and the discontinuance. Okay, we'll talk first about initiation of the proceedings, or the institution of the proceedings. To initiate the proceeding, to institute the proceeding, the institution of the proceeding itself. Powers of the prosecutor in the institution of proceedings. So, looking at your textbook at page 226, it says here, institution means to found or to initiate or to commence. So to commence proceeding, to initiate proceeding is considered to be institution of proceeding. In the case of Lim Chui Wang, Sophian LP defined the term to institute to mean to set on foot, initiate, start, so that the Attorney General has power at his discretion to initiate a case. So I think a simple language adalah untuk memulakan satu proceeding, memulakan satu case. And in the case of PP against manager of MBF Building Services Berhad, to institute means to commence. Cases differ as to when proceedings are instituted. To commence a proceeding, memulakan satu proceeding. So when are proceedings considered to be instituted? The simple answer is that if you look through all the authorities, the simple answer is that a proceeding is instituted, the proceedings began, or a proceeding commenced when the accused is called upon to plea. Called upon to plea on what? Called upon to plea on the charge. So when the accused was brought to the court, if he was arrested or if it's a summons case, he came to court, he come before the court, a charge being read out, the charge concerning the offense is said to have committed, a charge being read out, and then is asked the question whether he pleads guilty or claim trial. So when this charge being read out is called upon to plea, the institution has begun. So that is according to the case of Perumal against PP, which is in 1970 to MLG 265. The proceedings are instituted when the accused persons plead to the charges. In Kohei Hosoi against PP, it's a case of 1998. The court opined that the institution of proceedings is when the accused is called to plead to the charge. So when it's called upon to plead the charge, that's the beginning of the institution. The beginning of the proceedings. Note that this is the beginning of the proceedings. So the proceedings include the trial is part of the proceeding. So when does a trial begins? A trial begins when the first witness is being called. When the first witness is being called, he was questioned, give evidence in examination in chief. That's when the trial begins. So that's a difference of opinion. Some people say that the trial begins when the first witness been called to give evidence. But there are others who think that the trial is a proceeding. So since it's a proceeding, so it should begin when the accused is called upon to plead. So we leave that issue for a while. So we go on to the next issue concerning the institution of this proceeding. The discretion to institute proceeding is solely with the public prosecutor. Okay, this has been mentioned before, following what has been stated under the article of the Constitution and also section 376, having direction and control over all prosecution. So the public prosecutor, who is the AG, has got the discretion to institute the proceeding. His discretion. So what does his discretion mean? So we look at the cases. Discretion, budi bicara. So it's up to him. It's up to the DPP. Nobody can actually interfere in his powers. Nobody can question him. Nobody can interfere in his powers, whether to prosecute or not to prosecute. That discretion is solely with the public prosecutor. So, as stated in your textbook at page 227, Article 145 of the Federal Constitution and Section 376 of the CPC confer wide discretionary powers on the public prosecutor to institute proceedings. This wide discretionary power of the public prosecutor to institute proceedings has been challenged in the courts but to no avail, as illustrated in the following cases. So of course, you've got wide discretionary powers, is discretion of the PP. That discretion, that decision to prosecute, of course, is based on the evidence that was collected during investigation. As I already mentioned earlier in the earlier lectures, the enforcement agencies such as the police and other enforcement agencies will do the investigations, and during investigation they will collect the evidence, and then all the evidence collected, statement of witnesses and evidence and documents whatsoever that constitute evidence will be compiled in a file and handed over to the Deputy Public Prosecutor, who is carrying out the powers of the PP as stated just now. So is the discretion of the PP or the PP based on the evidence collected by the investigation to make a decision whether to initiate a proceedings or not. So the decision the DPP or the PP has to make here is either there are sufficient evidence to prove a case in court, or they are not sufficient. There are no sufficient evidence. There are not enough evidence to bring a case to court. So in the case of this not enough evidence, the evidence is insufficient, then the DPP may decide not to prosecute, and nobody can interfere with that decision. Of course, you can make an appeal, but that decision is solely with the PP, with the public prosecutor. And also, when the decision to prosecute is also with the public prosecutor, nobody can challenge his decision to prosecute other than claim trial in court. So what happened among the powers, among these discretionary powers here, not only just to make a decision whether to prosecute or not to prosecute, also on what charges to prosecute, what offenses that accused person is to be prosecuted under. That is also within the powers of the public prosecutor. So we look at an example in the case of Long bin Samad at page 227. The case of Long bin Samad against PP, 1974, case in 1974, cited at 1 MLJ, page 152. So it's stated here in your textbook at page 227, accused was convicted by the magistrate court for voluntarily causing hurt by dangerous weapons or means under section 324 of the Penal Code, where the punishment is 3 years imprisonment. The accused appealed on the grounds that issue had been charged under section 326 of the Penal Code, an offence of voluntarily causing grievous hurt by dangerous weapons or means, with imprisonment 20 years and fine or whipping, and tried in the Sessions Court, and hence the trial in the magistrate court was a nullity. So what it means here, this person, the accused person, he caused an injury to someone using dangerous weapon. Now, causing an injury using dangerous weapons is an offence under section 326 of the Penal Code, which carries the maximum sentence of 20 years imprisonment. But instead, he was charged with a lesser charge, He was charged with a lesser charge of causing grievous hurt. Causing grievous hurt using dangerous weapons was not mentioned. So meaning that causing grievous hurt without the use of weapons. So that is an offence under section 324, which carries a punishment of 3 years imprisonment, which brings the case before the magistrate's court under the jurisdiction of a magistrate. A charge under section 326 should be tried in the sessions court. A charge under because of the maximum punishment of 20 years. But the trial under section 326 can be tried before a magistrate because the offence only carries a maximum of 3 years within the jurisdiction of a magistrate. So what the accused is arguing here is that he's saying that since this is a case of causing grievous hurt with a weapon, which is an offence under section 326, so he should have been charged in the sessions court. Therefore, the fact that he was charged in the magistrate court, that trial was a nullity. So I hope you are following what I'm trying to explain here. It's not a case when an accused person saying that he is asking for a heavier charge to be imposed, to be charged against him instead of a lesser charge. But he's saying that the trial is a nullity because yes, it is a wrong charge. It's tried before a wrong court. Therefore, that trial is a nullity. That's the argument of the defense in this case. But the court here says, the federal court here says that the trial in a magistrate court was not a nullity as the public prosecutor has a very wide discretionary powers to institute, conduct or discontinue any proceeding for an offence under Article 145 of the Federal Constitution. The learned law president opined that the public prosecutor had the discretion to prefer whatever charge he deemed fit, and the court could not interfere with the exercise of this discretion, of his discretion. So meaning that this case, even though it's a case of causing grievous hurts with dangerous weapon, an offence under section 326, which should have been tried in the sessions court, but when the public prosecutor chose to charge with a lesser offence of 324, which carries only a maximum of 3 years, and therefore the trial is before a magistrate, that trial before the magistrate is valid, is not a nullity, because it's the discretion of the public prosecutor whenever or whoever, whatever charge he wants to prefer. So maknanya, to put it simply in layman's term for purpose of easier understanding, in case you're still not getting it, kuasa pendakwa raya itu, pendakwa raya is public prosecutor, untuk menuduh di bawah apa-apa kesalahan, walaupun kesalahan itu adalah kesalahan yang lebih ringan, dia dituduh dia melakukan kesalahan menyebabkan kecederaan menggunakan senjata, tetapi public prosecutor menuduh dia di bawah kesalahan menyebabkan kecederaan sahaja, bukan menggunakan senjata. Itu adalah pilihan, itu ada kuasa pendakwa raya. It does not make the charge illegal. It does not make the trial a nullity. Okay. Case Johnston Tan, satu lagi landmark case on the powers of the PP, discretionary powers of the PP, case Johnston Tan. So secara umumnya, Johnston Tan's case was actually a case under ISA when this is before when ISA was still in force, before it has been abolished. So under ISA, before it's been abolished, there is an offence of not an offence, there's a trial under the ISA. It's an offence under ISA which Section 57 was actually carrying firearms in the security area. Section 57, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me right, is an offence of carrying firearms in a security area which carries the death sentence. So IAC ini adalah tinggalan daripada zaman komunis dulu, di mana dijadikan satu kesalahan yang boleh dihukum mati jika seseorang itu memiliki senjata di dalam satu kawasan keselamatan, security area. Security area itu adalah being declared by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. Yang di-Pertuan Agong has the power to declare which area is a security area, and the Yang di-Pertuan Agong has declared that the whole of Malaysia is a security area. So under the IAC, before its abolishment, under the IAC, anybody who's having firearm without license, illegal possession of firearm, in Malaysia is considered to be possessing firearm illegally in a security area, which is an offence which carries the death penalty. So the argument in case Johnson Tan here is that Section 57 of the IAC is actually when he was charged under Section 57 of the IAC, instead of being charged under the Firearms Act, we have already an offence of illegal possession of firearms is already provided for under the Firearms Act. Akta Senjata Api. Di bawah senjata api, Akta Senjata Api ada kesalahan memiliki senjata api secara tidak sah, secara illegal, secara haram. But there is also under the IAC, dia ada satu lagi kesalahan pula. Under the IAC also provide for illegal possession of firearm in a security area which carries a death penalty. So what I'm trying to say here, there is one act which is illegally possessing a firearm, tetapi there are two laws that can be used to charge you with. Satu under the Firearms Act, increased penalty 1971, Firearms Act ataupun Firearms Increased Penalty under beza antara Firearms Act dengan Firearms Increased Penalty ni adalah Firearms Act adalah Akta Senjata Api where possession of firearms is illegal. Firearms Increased Penalty adalah when you are committing a scheduled offence using a firearms which carries a heavier sentence. So kita ada Firearms Act, kita ada Firearms Increased Penalty Act, under which a person illegally possessing firearm can be charged with, and also the IAC before IAC been abolished. So this situation which I've already stated just now, has been used by the defense to argue that saying that the fact that he was charged under Section 57, which carries the death penalty, is an act of discrimination. An act of discrimination and goes against Article 8 of the Federal Constitution. Oh no, sorry, that's another case. Bukan case, yeah, betul. He should have been charged, he appealed, sorry, I ulang balik sekali, I baca from page 227 ni. He appealed arguing for equality before the law under Article 8 of the Federal Constitution, and that he should have been charged under the Firearms Act or the Firearms Increased Penalty Act. So he says that there is an inequality before the law. Ada kena charge di bawah IAC which carries the death penalty, ada charge under Firearms Act, ada charge under Firearms Increased Penalty Act for the same act, the same offence, which is illegal possession of firearm. So when you've been charged, when the accused in this case was charged under the most serious offence under the most serious law, which is which is the IAC, he's saying that there is discrimination because he has been treated unequally before the law, whereas our Article 8 Federal Constitution guarantee equality before the law. So that's the argument. So what did the court say under that argument? Again, the law president at that time, our Justice Sufyan, Delivering the judgment in the federal court said that Article 1453 of the Federal Constitution prevails over Article 8 in that the public prosecutor has the discretion to prefer the charge under Section 57 of the Internal Security Act. So you can see the same decision has been repeated in all the other cases. So let's just go briefly through the other cases. Case of Tay Cheng Po, Privy Council, held that the accused must be charged under the Internal Security Act, duly abolished, and not under Firearms Increased Penalty Act or the Firearms Act, as the offence was committed in a security area. As I already mentioned just now, the offence under ISA is meant for an offence committed in security area, but the YDPA has declared the whole of the country as a security area. I didn't quite understand when it says here that this decision will reverse the decision of Johnston Tan, notwithstanding Section 11(1) of the Emergency Essential Powers 1979, no longer relevant, ICA has been abolished, was introduced after Tay Cheng Po case, which expressly provides that the public prosecutor has the absolute discretion to charge for any offence, even though the offence was committed in security area. Thus, it reinstated the decision of Johnston Tan. I don't quite understand Tay Cheng Po as reported. The case in your textbook, case Tay Cheng Po, as it is reported by the author in this book at page 228. I don't quite follow what he's trying to say here. Tay Cheng Po, Privy Council of the Appeals of the Charge, and this decision will reverse the decision of Johnston Tan, outstanding Section 11A was introduced after Tay Cheng Po's case, which expressly provides that the public prosecutor has the absolute discretion to charge for any offence, though the offence was committed in the security area. Thus, it reinstated the decision of Johnston Tan. Betul lah tu. It reinstated the decision of Johnston Tan. So, kenapa awal tu dia kata this decision will reverse the decision of Johnston Tan? Kena baca balik case Tay Cheng Po ni. Got to find out, got to read the actual decision in Tay Cheng Po. I've already forgotten the facts of the case. I don't think in Tay Cheng Po he might not. Just let the azan goes. Okay, Teh Cheng Po. I can't recall what is the facts under Teh Cheng Po, but in Teh Cheng Po, his lordship tried to give sort of like a guideline when to charge under the ISA for possession of firearm, when to charge the firearms increased penalty, when to charge under the Firearms Act itself. All this regarding an offence of firearm. However, for example, the judge in that case says that if that person has got a record being a member of the Communist Party whatsoever, he could be charged under the ISA. But if it's someone who has a record of being a member of secret society or something, he could be charged under firearm increased penalty. But if it's just an ordinary person without any record, just so happens to be in possession of firearm without a license, then he should be charged under the Firearms Act. However, in Teh Cheng Po, the judge acknowledged that whichever charge the PP wants to prefer is at the discretion of the public prosecutor. So what it means here, saying that looking at the offence, this case, in Teh Cheng Po's case, looking at the offence, that person should have been charged under the ISA. But if the public prosecutor has already charged him under a different charge other than the ISA, then that is up to the discretion of the public prosecutor. So the most important thing is from Teh Cheng Po, one act, one offence, doesn't matter how many laws it contravenes, it's up to the public prosecutor which an offence under which law the public prosecutor charged that person. So that same decision has been repeated in Lee Timbao, where it follows Johnson Tan. You can read it yourself. But I want to refer straight to the case of Jamali Adnan. So what happened in Jamali Adnan was that the accused was charged and sentenced Sessions Court for robbery. He was charged and sentenced at the Sessions Court for the offence of robbery. But after he was charged and sentenced at the Sessions Court for robbery, he's again been charged under the ISA for the possession of firearms. He was also charged under the ISA for the possession of firearms and he was sentenced to death. So dia menggunakan senjata api untuk pergi merompak. Dia dituduh dan disabitkan atas kesalahan merompak di session court. Kemudian dia dituduh pula memiliki senjata yang digunakan semasa merompak tu di bawah ISA dan dihukum dengan hukuman mati. So I think he appealed and it's a valid argument in appeal, the question of counterfoil convict. He's already been convicted. Counterfoil convict is being convicted for the same offence. Tetapi he's been charged again and convicted again for the same act, which is illegal possession, for the same act under a different law. So what did the court say here? The Supreme Court held that the new charges were lawful and the accused could not use the defence of counterfoil convict. Why is that so? I agree with the decision. And why is that decision so? Because in this case he is found to be he is committing an offence of robbery using a firearm. The charge and conviction at the Sessions Court is for the robbery. The charge under ISA is for the possession of the firearm. So with the same act, he committed two different and distinct offences under two different laws. So his argument of counterfoil convict then cannot stand. And this case also reflects the power of the PP in deciding whether to charge, not to charge a person, and deciding under which law, which offence that person should be charged. Mustafa Ahmad, the accused, was charged under again ISA Section 57, duly abolished. He argued that Article 8, the same argument as in the case of Johnson Tan, Article 8 Federal Constitution had been contravened as he had been charged under Firearms Increased Penalty Act. And the judge held Article 1453 prevails over Article 8 of the Federal Constitution, meaning that there is no contravention of the principle of equality before the law when the public prosecutor choose to charge a person under a heavier charge when he could have been charged also with a lesser charge. So if there are two laws, ISA and Firearms Act, firearms is a lesser offence, carries a lesser sentence, and the ISA carries the heavier sentence, which is death penalty, the PP has got the power to charge under whichever he prefers, and when he decide, according to his discretion, his prerogative, under the provisions of Article 1453 of the Constitution, what he did is not in contravention of Article 8 of the Constitution, which guarantees equality before the law. Okay, I hope you understand this. These are the decisions dalam Mustafa Ahmad, which follows Johnston Tan. Chan Kam Leong, suspect was first detained. Okay, Chan Kam Leong ni isu dia seorang itu didapati positif dadah. Air kencing dia positif dadah. So, he could be detained at the rehab center for being a drug addict. He could have been detained at the rehabilitation center to rehabilitate, untuk dibaik pulih sebagai seorang penagih dadah. But instead, he was charged under Section 51 of the Dangerous Drug Act, Section 15(1)(a), which is memasukkan dadah ke dalam badan sendiri. So again, the argument was that he should have been sent to pusat untuk dipulih, tetapi pihak pendakwaan tuduh dia untuk memasukkan dadah ke dalam badan sendiri. So the magistrate referred it to the High Court, and Justice Zakaria Yatim referred to Section 3761 of the CPC, which we referred just now, and Article 1453 of the Federal Constitution, and said that the public prosecutor had the discretion to charge the accused under the Dangerous Drug Act 1952, whether there was self-administration dependent on the facts of the case. Sama ada dia memasukkan dadah ataupun tidak, itu adalah fakta kes lah untuk dibicarakan. Sama ada dia ada masukkan dadah dalam diri, itu adalah satu isu untuk dibicarakan dalam mahkamah untuk menentukan fakta itu. But the fact that the public prosecutor chose to charge him under the Dangerous Drug Act and not detain him at the rehabilitation center under the Drug Treatment and Rehabilitation Act, that is prerogative, again prerogative and discretion of the public prosecutor, which the court cannot interfere. So, dalam kes Sukma Darmawan Sasmitat Maja, kes Sukma, if you remember history, I'm not sure how old you all were when this case come up for trial, and it would be interesting also if you can find out who was one of the DPP who conducted this case. It was me lah. Okay, the accused was charged for sodomy under Section 377B of the Penal Code, kesalahan bawah Section 377B, sodomy. The defense applied for the sodomy case to be tried under the Sharia law under Article 121(1)(a) of the Federal Constitution. Okay, apa berlaku di sini? Dia dituduh kerana melakukan kesalahan liwat. Argument dia kata liwat adalah satu perkara di bawah Islamic law. So kalau perkara itu di bawah Islamic law, dia sepatutnya dituduh dan dibicarakan di bawah Sharia Court, not in kita punya mahkamah magistrate biasa atau mahkamah magistrate atau mahkamah session. Tetapi this is what the Court of Appeal said, held that the public prosecutor has the discretion to prefer where to charge under Article 1453 of the Federal Constitution, and this implies that Article 1453 prevails over Article 121. The Federal Court also affirmed the Court of Appeal's decision later. Okay, so disahkan oleh Federal Constitution. So satu kesalahan itu liwat, boleh jadi di bawah mahkamah, di bawah Penal Code, boleh juga di bawah Syariah. Tetapi kalau public prosecutor sudah membuat pilihan untuk menuduh di bawah Penal Code, then tiada, mahkamah tak boleh campur tangan. Mahkamah cannot say that that is not illegal, he should have been charged under different law and all that. That's the discretion of the public prosecutor as provided for under Section 145 and Section 376. So kesimpulan dia, So kesimpulan dia, which offence the prosecution wants to charge with, under which law the prosecution wants to charge with, is the prosecution's, the public prosecutor's prerogative, his discretion. Even if someone were to think, the court were to think that, oh, this should have been an offence under this and not an offence under this, itu situ lain lah. That he could have been charged under offence A, he could be charged under offence B, he could be charged under offence C. The court cannot say that he should have been charged under this offence, not that offence. He should have been charged under this offence or not that offence, because the court's function is only to see whether the offence under which he was charged under or charged with, the offence he was charged with, has been made out by the prosecution or not. That's all. So bukan menentukan, oh, dia sepatutnya dituduh di bawah undang-undang ini, dia sepatutnya dituduh bawah undang-undang ini, atau dia sepatutnya dituduh di bawah undang-undang ini. This is the discretion of the public prosecutor. That's what institution of proceedings means. Dia nak institute, tak nak institute, to charge or not to charge, discretion dia, the public prosecutor. Under which law dia nak charge, also prosecution, public prosecutor punya discretion. Okay, that's on the issue of institution of proceedings. Kemudian sebelum institution of proceeding, there is the issue dalam dalam institution of proceeding, there is an issue. If you look at certain provisions of the law, certain provisions, certain act, certain akta memperuntukkan bahawa the institution of proceedings, the prosecution under that act atau prosecution under that law requires an authorization, requires consent, sanction atau authorization of the public prosecutor. So consent of the public prosecutor, meaning that before you can charge anybody under this offence, you have to get the consent of the public prosecutor. Also, there are certain laws that say that before anybody wants to charge under this offence, you have to get a sanction from the public prosecutor. And then other than that, there is also an issue of authorization. Now, authorization is not only authorization to prosecute anyone under the law, but also the authorization for the officer conducting that prosecution. So ini selalunya terpakai dalam keadaan yang mana undang-undang di bawah agensi-agensi, undang-undang di bawah jabatan kesihatan. There are offences provided by the health laws, undang-undang peraturan atau jabatan kesihatan, di mana pegawai daripada jabatan kesihatan akan melakukan pendakwaan, contohnya. Ataupun beberapa akta-akta lain seperti EPF, akta-akta seperti securities industry, akta seperti SPRM, SPRM Act, akta seperti perhilitan, custom, all these agency and even majlis tempatan, all these agencies ada kesalahan-kesalahan yang diperuntukkan di bawah undang-undang masing-masing, dalam bidang masing-masing, dan juga diperuntukkan bahawa siapa yang boleh mengendalikan pendakwaan, the prosecuting officers who can conduct those prosecutions. So these laws usually will have a provision that says that prosecution under this offence requires a consent or sanction from the public prosecutor or deputy public prosecutor. So consent ataupun izin, sanction has been translated as sanksi. I'm not so sure what is correct bahasa Malaysia word for sanction. So the consent of public prosecutor, it says there, for certain offences, I'm reading at page 230 of your textbook. For certain offences, the consent of public prosecutor is required to commence proceedings, while for other offences, the written sanctions of the public prosecutor are required for the written authorization of public prosecutor will suffice. So apa yang dimasukkan sini macam saya beritahu dah, di bawah undang-undang certain agency tadi diperuntukkan bahawa pendakwaan perlu dapat izin ataupun sanksi. dan juga siapa pegawai yang boleh mengendalikan, dan juga pegawai-pegawai ataupun prosecuting officers yang mengendalikan penawaran itu juga perlu dapatkan authorization daripada public prosecutor. Okay, contoh kes kita tengok dalam PP against pengurus MBF Building Services yang Berhad. The court made it clear that in the absence of any provision in a law to say that the public prosecutor may institute proceedings under that law, the public prosecutor may nevertheless institute proceedings, and his action to institute proceedings may be manifested by either consent, sanction or other form of authorization. So ini dalam keadaan yang terbalik lah. Undang-undang itu tidak memperuntukkan sesiapa pun untuk tidak memperuntukkan sesiapa untuk mengendalikan penawaan dan sebagainya. So kalau tidak diperuntukkan di bawah undang-undang itu, dia kembali balik kepada artikel 145 dan juga CPC. Kuasa itu has always been with the public prosecutor. So public prosecutor boleh menjalankan pendakwaan, memulakan pendakwaan, mengendalikan pendakwaan di dalam apa-apa undang-undang di Malaysia ini. Okey. So sanction consent ni apa dia ni? Dalam kes Ang Tiong Tom, Justice Court of Appeal Judge at that time, Abdul Hamid Muhammad, in our view, the prosecution cannot be instituted unless the consent or sanction is given. In this case, sanction, subject to Section 422B. But in the present case, it is the authority to conduct the prosecution that is an issue. In our view, so long as it is given in this case before the trial begins, it should be sufficient. It is at the trial stage that really conducts the prosecution. Ini berkaitan dengan isu yang saya sebut tadi, authorization untuk conduct that prosecution. Siapa yang authorized to conduct the prosecution? Pegawai-pegawai. Contoh saya dah bagi tadi lah. Agensi-agensi, penguat kuasa. Apa kuasa dia nak menjalankan pendakwaan? Sedangkan artikel 145 dengan ini membentukkan pendakwaan di bawah kuasa pendakwa raya. So he has to get authorization. And the section yang relevan adalah section 377 of the CPC. So you tengok section 377 CPC tu, every criminal prosecution before any court and every inquiry before magistrate shall subject to the following sections be conducted by the DPP, senior DPP, blah 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 blah. Ini semua prosecution tadi isu. Subject to the control and direction of the public prosecutor by the following persons who are authorized in writing by the public prosecutor: advocate, police officer, officer in the government department, officer local authority, officer statutory authority, person employed and retained by any local authority. So orang-orang dalam grup ini perlu mendapatkan written authorization. So siapa orang-orang dalam ni? Macam dia kata situ, officer of any statutory authority, maknanya kalau majlis pembandaran, pendakwaan majlis pendakwaan di bawah akta majlis pembandaran, contoh you tak bayar parking, kena saman, tak bayar saman, kena bawa pergi mahkamah. Siapa nak tuduh kat mahkamah tu? Pegawai daripada majlis pembandaran. So dia perlu dapatkan authorization daripada PP. Kalau tidak, dia tak ada kuasa. Statutory authority sama juga. EPF, CIDB, banyak statutory authority macam SOCSO, macam EPF yang ada kuasa pendakwaan, yang derive dia punya kuasa pendakwaan daripada ni lah section 377 ni, daripada PP. Okey, sebelum pendakwaan dijalankan kena ada consent atau sanction, izin atau sanksi. So what is consent, what is sanction? Kita tengok kes Abdul Hamid against PP. Offence the accused was charged with required consent to be tendered to the court by the prosecution from the public prosecutor. However, the deputy public prosecutor only issued a sanction to prosecute. Smith J. held that the sanction cannot be evidence of a consent because the consent is different from a sanction. Justice Smith's judgment had the effect that consent is more serious than sanction, as the former requires deeper consideration. There is an essential difference to my mind, between the sanction and the consent. This is only show a difference between consent dengan sanction. A prosecution can be sanctioned without any deep consideration of the particular case. Full consideration is required for consent, since consent is an act of or reason accompanied with deliberation, the mind weighing as in balance the good and evil on each side. So consent ni dia lebih mendalam, dia require deliberation. So perlu dibaca, diteliti kes itu, make deliberation and baru boleh issue consent. Sanction is just macam kebenaran. Kebenaran secara umum. Satu pihak berkuasa, satu agensi ingin menjalankan pendakwaan, berjumpa dengan timbalan pendakwa raya kata okey boleh jalankan pendakwaan itu without any deep deliberation. So dalam page 232 tu ada disenaraikan perbezaan di antara consent dengan sanction. Consent for more serious offence differ and full consideration. Sanction for less serious offence. Prosecution can be sanctioned without any deep consideration. Lepas tu, consent and sanction ni kadang-kadang perlu dalam bentuk bertulis. Kenapa dalam bentuk bertulis? Because the law itself requires. Kadang-kadang dalam satu akta, satu statutory, satu statute itu diperuntukkan such as it says that the prosecution under this offence cannot be instituted without written consent of the public prosecutor. So clearly undang-undang itu memerlukan izin secara bertulis. Kan? Ataupun kadang-kadang undang-undang tu cuma menyebutkan memerlukan izin tanpa menyebutkan izin secara bertulis. So kalau memerlukan izin saja, as long as you dapat izin daripada pihak menawan, daripada DPP atau PP untuk prosecute, cukup. Tetapi kalau dia memerlukan izin secara bertulis, then you have to have that written consent be produced to court to show that the PP has consented in writing for this offence to be prosecuted, for these proceedings to be instituted. Okay. So contoh-contoh provisions yang memerlukan consent, Section 58 of Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission. So selalunya semua kesalahan di bawah akta SPRM di Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Act requires a consent from the BPP from the PP. And also Section 177A of the CPC, offence to be tried by the High Court. Semua kesalahan dibicarakan di Mahkamah Tinggi perlukan izin daripada pendakwa raya. Section 39B, of course, Section 39B memerlukan izin daripada timbalan pendakwa raya. And Section 375 of the Capital Market and Services Act, Section 35 Capital Market Services Act ni concern, I think, the manipulation of shares and things like that lah. The manipulation of the share market, insider trading ke whatsoever they call it. So for offences under the Capital Market and Services Act, which concern offences in the business of shares and all that, capital here means modal syarikat. So also requires consent in writing daripada public prosecutor. So all this requires consent. So there have been cases where di awal-awal lah, zaman dulu-dulu, in the earlier days of these laws, especially laws yang membawa kepada hukuman mati, contohnya macam IAC 39B. There are times that those days that the prosecution went to prosecute without any written consent by the public prosecutor, written consent yang bertulis. So because it was not the practice before that for written consent to be given. So what happened when there was no written consent? Kita ambil contoh dalam kes PP against Wei Kui at page 233 of your textbook. Deputy Public Prosecutor himself was the prosecutor where the accused was charged for an offence under Section 57 of the IAC. Dah tak ada dah IAC sekarang, ini dulu. Without the consent of the public prosecutor, the counsel objected. So, Timbalan Pendakwa Raya hadir di mahkamah untuk mengendalikan satu pendakwaan di bawah IAC. IAC adalah satu pendakwaan di mahkamah tinggi. Di bawah IAC perlukan konsen daripada public prosecutor. The deputy public prosecutor tidak ada konsen bertulis daripada public prosecutor. So, defense objected. Lodge Hodgson held that the presence of the deputy public prosecutor means implied consent of the public prosecutor. This means that the deputy public prosecutor is the alter ego of the prosecutor. So, dalam case Johnston Tan pun sama, the DPP was the alter ego of the public prosecutor. Sama juga dalam kes Muhammad Halifah. Muhammad Halifah ni beza sikit. Ada izin bertulis tetapi kemudian ada pindaan kepada pertuduhan tu. Selepas dipinda, pertuduhan tu jadi pertuduhan yang baru. Pertuduhan yang baru tu tidak ada written consent. So same argument. So in all these cases, the court held that since the deputy public prosecutor was the alter ego of the public prosecutor, his presence itself was sufficient to mean consent. So dalam semua kes ni, because of section 376 3, where it's provided that the deputy public prosecutor can represent the public prosecutor, appointed the public prosecutor, to carry out the powers of the public prosecutor under the direction and control direction public prosecutor. Therefore, mahkamah menganggapkan bahawa the court assumed that when the deputy public prosecutor comes to court to prosecute, he is doing so under the direction and control of the public prosecutor by virtue of section 3763. So, in other words, he is the alter ego of the public prosecutor. Since he is the alter ego of the public prosecutor, the fact that he himself is prosecuting, it means that the public prosecutor has consented to the prosecution under that offence. Faham kan? So these are the provisions under kes Muhammad Halifah, Johnston Tan, Kui, dan kes K yang sebagainya lah. Tetapi ada tetapi dia juga. Ada juga kes yang kemudian yang mengatakan bahawa sekiranya peruntukan undang-undang itu, contohnya di bawah section 39B, peruntukan undang-undang itu mengatakan bahawa pendakwaan di bawah undang-undang ini memerlukan izin secara bertulis. When the prosecution under that laws requires a consent in writing from the public prosecutor, then the consent has to be in writing by the public prosecutor. The mere presence of the deputy public prosecutor is not enough. Nampak tak beza antara kedudukan awal tadi, where the court says that the presence of the deputy public prosecutor is sufficient because he is the alter ego of the PP, and the fact that his presence means that the PP has consented. Tetapi dalam keadaan where it requires a written consent, then you must have a written consent. The mere presence was not sufficient. So ni I think was provided for dalam kes Jamali Anan. Dalam Jamali Anan dikatakan at page 233 again, an issue arose as to whether consent must be in writing. It was decided that if a statute does not state that the consent must be in writing, then the consent of public prosecutor may be oral where the deputy public prosecutor conducts the proceeding as decided in Jamali Anan. So dalam Jamali Anan punya case, dikatakan bahawa undang-undang itu tidak memerlukan consent itu to be in writing. There is no provision that say the consent in writing. Dia tak sebut consent in writing. So kalau tak sebut consent in writing, then that consent need not be in writing. The presence of the deputy public prosecutor is sufficient because he represents the public prosecutor, is the alter ego of public prosecutor. Tetapi kalau contohnya dalam Go Kiat Peng, Dalam kes Goh Kiat Peng, in this case under section 27 of the Police Act, a prosecution shall not be instituted except with consent in writing of the public prosecutor. This is provided for under the Police Act. Di bawah Police Act dikatakan bahawa a prosecution shall not be instituted except with consent in writing of the public prosecutor. So the court held that the requirement of the consent of the public prosecutor must specifically state which limb of the offence under section 37, and the doctrine of alter ego has no application in offences under the Police Act because of the words consent in writing. So bila ada consent in writing, meaning that implied consent is insufficient. Implied consent ni maknanya yang alter ego tadi lah, konsep alter ego tu, the presence of the DPP in court representing the PP, representing the public prosecutor, impliedly means that the public prosecutor consented for the prosecution. Okey, kalau undang-undang itu tidak menyebutkan consent in writing, tapi di under Police Act, he says specifically consent in writing. So therefore, you have to produce a written consent by the public prosecutor dalam case tu. Okay, I'm taking a break here sekejap. We are going to continue in part 2. Part 2, we are going to talk about sanction. Tadi sanction, remember the three topics: consent, sanction, authorization. I'm going to talk about these three topics in this lecture. So now I'm taking a break for a while, and then we're going to continue with the next topic, which is sanction. Okay, see you later.